Okay. So just quickly, a disclaimer. Please consult your personal physician regarding any issues regarding your personal health history. I'm not your physician. I have no idea what your personal health history entails. So any decisions you make should be made in conjunction with your physician. Any decisions that you're making for your child should be done in conjunction with your child's pediatrician. And just a little bit about me, for those of you who don't know me, I am a lifelong Saddlebrook resident. I graduated from Saddlebrook High School, class of 1995. I went to long school, and I now have two daughters who are in the Saddlebrook school system in the 4th grade and the 8th grade. I got my bachelor's degree from the College of New Jersey. That was followed by my PhD from Rutgers Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences, used to be known as UMDNJ. That's what it was called when I went there, but it's now been taken over by Rutgers. And when I finished my PhD, I went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship at Hackensack University Medical Center. So during my PhD work, I focused a lot on the immune response to viral infection. During my postdoc, I switched gears a little bit and studied immunotherapy for different types of cancer. And I continue to work with my collaborators at Hackensack University Medical Center. Once the pandemic hit, we actually put a pause on our immunotherapy studies and started studying COVID. I did much of the scientific community. So now my current studies involve looking at convalescent plasma therapy for the treatment of COVID. And for the past 7 years, I've taught medical microbiology and immunology to medical students at Toro College of Osteopathic Medicine. It's in New York City, right in the middle of Harlem, right across from the Apollo Theater. This topic, vaccines, is so important that I teach it to my students 3 times in the 2 years that I have them. So it's really so important for human health and public health in general. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we go. So I just want to start out by giving super basic background on how the immune system works. It's really important when you're understanding why we do vaccines to understand a little bit about how our immune system works. So our immune system can be broken down broadly into sort of 3 levels. Our most basic levels are our barriers. So our skin is part of our immune system. It functions as a barrier to keep foreign infectious agents out. Our mucous membranes that are in our respiratory tract, our nose, our lungs, our gut, those are part of our immune system. They're designed to keep out infectious agents. They're also coated with lots of different antimicrobial chemicals. Mucus itself is there to help trap all those germs so they can't get in our bodies. But at some point, those barriers can get breached. And at that point, we go to level 2. And our level 2 defenses are called our innate defenses. And these are basically just cells and chemicals that raise the alarm bells. It's very nonspecific. The job at this level is just to determine what's harmful and what's not harmful, right? Because it's not enough for something to be foreign. Our bodies come in contact with foreign things all the time. Everything we eat is foreign. Anything we put on our skin, things we breathe, they're all foreign, but they're not harmful to us. And we don't want our bodies to react to them. We want our bodies to react to the foreign things that are harmful. And that's at level 2, where we're able to distinguish harmful from harmless. When something is determined to be harmful, like viruses, bacteria that can cause disease, at this level, inflammation is a big trigger. We basically start out with that inflammatory response, and that's the signal to our body that something's invaded and something's dangerous. And that's going to be the trigger for level 3. Level 3 is also known as our adaptive response. And this is where our immune response gets specific. And this is where we're able to very effectively and efficiently clear infection. And this is where we're able to establish immunologic memory, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So I love cartoons of cells. My students would tell you I'm constantly finding cute videos and cute cartoons of cells. So this website always does a really good job of having these cute pictures. And when it comes to the cells that make up our immune system, they're commonly referred to as our white blood cells. I'm sure most of you have heard that term. If you've had blood work done, you see on that list of things that they're looking at, it shows you your levels of white blood cells. But within those white blood cells, there's a lot of variety of cells. And the cells that really give us that robust, specific immunity are called our lymphocytes. and they come in different flavors. We have what are known as our helper T cells. Those are basically the generals that give instructions to everything else. We have our killer T cells. Their job is to kill infected cells. And the cell I'm probably going to talk about the most is our B cell, also known as a plasma cell. And these are the cells that make antibodies. Okay, so if we take a look at our B cell a little bit more specifically, our B cells are circulating within our blood, and all of our B cells have these molecules on their surface. They're these Y-shaped molecules that are specific for slightly different pathogens. So we might have some B cells that are specific for flu virus, and some B cells that are specific for E. coli, and some B cells that are specific for coronavirus. So in this case, if we are infected with coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2 is the technical name of the virus that causes COVID-19. The B cells that are specific for that will recognize those pieces of that virus. And the very first step is for them to make tons of copies of themselves. So we're basically building an army that's going to be specific for that particular infection, in this case, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And what those cells are going to eventually do is take that little Y-shaped molecule that's on their surface, and they're going to start spitting it out. They're going to start secreting it. This Y-shaped molecule, when it gets secreted, this is what our antibodies are. And these antibodies are all specific for that virus, and they're basically going to hunt it down and bind it so that it can't do anything. But one thing that I want to point out here is that this process takes time. So if we're talking about an infection that we're seeing for the first time, it's going to take about 2 to 3 weeks for these plasma cells to really gear up and start making high quantities of antibodies. Once they get geared up, each of these cells can make about 1,000 antibody molecules per second for upwards of 2 weeks. So once they get going, they really get going, but it just takes them a while. And the other thing that I want to point out is that while we're inducing this response that's geared towards fighting the immediate threat, we also have a proportion of these cells that become what are known as memory cells. These are the cells that are going to help us the next time we come in contact with this same infectious threat. So if we're talking about SARS-CoV-2, if we happen to be exposed to that again, these memory cells are going to take over. And one of the key differences between what's happening here on the right-hand side and what's happening on the left-hand side is the timing, because these memory cells, when they get re-triggered, they're only going to take 2 to 3 days to get activated. Okay. And so if we take a look a little bit more closely at what antibodies are actually doing, so here's our B cell or our plasma cell, starts spitting out all of these little Y-shaped antibodies. Antibodies are just basically proteins, very specific for the virus, and they're going to bind to the virus. So basically it can't do anything. It puts it in handcuffs. On the right-hand side here, I found an image that's looking a little bit more specifically at what's happening with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So I'm sure most of you have heard of this spike protein, right? It's what's on the outside of the viral particle, and it's what the virus uses to enter our cells. So this spike protein on the outside of the virus binds to this receptor on the outside of our cells called ACE2. And once that spike protein binds, it enables the virus to enter our cells. So during our immune response, when we make all of these antibody molecules, basically these antibody molecules bind to the virus. The best antibodies that we want are going to be the ones that bind to the spike protein, because now when that antibody is bound, it's keeping that viral particle from being able to interact with our cells, meaning it can't infect. Okay, so that's why antibodies are so powerful. And that's why when we're talking about immunity, there's so much focus on antibodies and antibody levels. The higher the levels of antibodies we have, the more we're going to be able to bind up those viral particles and prevent those viral particles from being able to enter and infect our cells. So I want to go back to the timing here because the timing is really critical in understanding the basis of vaccination. So if we look on the left-hand side of this graph, this is basically very simply diagramming what's happening during our primary immune response, right? So this arrow here all the way to the left is showing us the time of infection. At that point, our immune response gets activated. It's going to take, like I said, 2 to 3 weeks for those B cells to get activated and start producing high quantities of antibody, at which point they peak. Antibodies, because they are just proteins, all proteins degrade over time. And that's the same as the antibodies that are made during an immune response. Once we clear that infectious threat, our cells stop making antibody, and the antibody that we've already made slowly gets degraded. Okay, so the peak of this graph right here is about 2 to 3 weeks. And then slowly over time, those antibody levels start to wane. So by 3 to 6 months, normally most of that antibody that was made from the primary infection is gone. However, it doesn't mean we're completely unprotected, because it's a little bit hard to see here, but this green line started at 0. And when it comes back down at the other side, it doesn't go to 0. That's because some of those plasma cells that are making those high quantities of antibodies actually move to the bone marrow, and they can live for a really long time and produce low levels of antibodies. So sometimes those cells can make enough antibody that can protect us for even longer than that, say, 6-month period. And we see that with a lot of diseases that we have been vaccinated against. So MMR is a good example. It's a vaccine that we all get when we're young. And I don't know if any of you as adults have had your MMR titers checked, but I have. I'm over 40 and I still have antibodies to those MMR antigens. That's because those cells still live in my bone marrow and they still make little bits of antibody that's enough to keep me protected. Okay, and then we see the second arrow. So once this primary immune response wanes, the next time we're exposed to the same pathogen, we're going to have a completely different response. Now our timeline here is in days instead of weeks. So instead of taking 2 to 3 weeks for those B cells to start making high levels of antibody, it's only going to take 2 to 3 days. In addition, the amount of antibodies that get made is going to be way higher, and the quality of those antibodies is going to be higher. It's a more robust response. So that is why immunologic memory is so key. Once we've seen something, the next time we see it, if it reinfects us, we're able to respond to it really quickly. We'll be able to recover it. Sometimes we don't even know we're sick. Sometimes this is going on behind the scenes and our immune response is taking care of everything before we even know we're sick. So this is really the whole basis for vaccination, because what vaccination is doing is trying to mimic this primary response without clinical disease. So we're just giving the immune system something that looks close enough to the natural infection that it mounts that response. So then the next time we see that infectious agent in nature, we're already on to this second, larger, more robust, quicker response. That is the whole basis of vaccination. So vaccination is not new. The most modern era of vaccination really started in the 18th century, but if you go back all the way to 1000 AD, you can see ancient writings that talk about concepts similar to vaccination, where they take lesions and pus from infected individuals and inject it to protect uninfected individuals. But really the most modern era of vaccination started with Edward Jenner in the 18th century. And from then, we've just developed more vaccines. As we learn more about the immune response, we've been able to fine tune those vaccines, make them more effective, make them safer. And we continue to develop new vaccines. The HPV vaccine is one of the newest vaccines. It protects against cervical cancer. And it's shown to be really highly effective. Our hepatitis vaccines are also newer vaccines that have been shown to be really effective. So, we have been using vaccines for ages, and we know that these vaccines are effective because we have seen diseases be eradicated, and that is because of vaccination. So in this table, The red bars are showing you the average annual morbidity of some of these diseases during the 20th century. This was during the time frame where a lot of vaccines for these were being created. And then it shows you the actual cases that were reported in 2019. So we know things like smallpox completely eradicated. Smallpox does not exist in nature anymore because we vaccinated against it. Polio does not occur in the United States anymore, and it doesn't occur in most countries. I think there's only about 2 or 3 countries in the world where they still see some polio infections, but it has basically been eradicated thanks to vaccination. And a lot of these other diseases too, I'm sure most of you aren't really familiar with. You've never experienced anybody who had a rubella or mumps, maybe stories of your parents or grandparents who suffered from those diseases.
Dr.
One
Fanning,
exception
if I
is...
may.
Oh, do you have some questions?
No, just there's one question in the chat.
Sure.
So what about people who have natural antibodies due to exposure to COVID?
Yeah, so people who have been exposed to COVID do generate antibodies. That COVID infection is that primary response. So they will generate antibodies and they will be protected for a certain period of time. But just like any other infection, that immunity starts to wane. So the benefit of vaccination in that population is that vaccination acts as a booster, right? So if you got COVID back in March or April of 2020, you're well over a year past your initial infection. Most likely your antibody titers have gone way back down. So at this point, getting a vaccine is going to serve as a booster, and you're going to generate that robust immune response and just boost your protection. The other thing that's been seen with looking at the data of individuals who are immune because they had COVID versus those who are immune because they got vaccinated, it's actually been shown that the vaccinated individuals produce higher levels of antibodies, and the antibodies are sustained for longer with the vaccine versus natural exposure. So the vaccine is actually doing a better job of establishing that protective immunity than the natural infection does. So if you did have COVID, it's recommended that you do still get the vaccine. It's just going to let you continue that protection.
So there's 2 follow-ups to that, and then I'll go back to another question. But what about T-cell memory and bone marrow, like you just said?
Yeah.
But doesn't the vaccine remove your natural antibodies?
No, absolutely not. Nothing removes your natural antibodies. That doesn't happen. Your antibodies just slowly degrade over time. It happens with any immune response. It happens with any protein in your body. Proteins are not designed to last forever. They just degrade in our body, and our body has to continually make new proteins. And having vaccination has no impact on that whatsoever. In regards to our cellular response and our T cells, that's something that is currently under investigation. So, when we look at responses to vaccines and look at responses to natural infection, it's really easy to measure antibody levels. You just take a blood sample, you look at the plasma. It's really not very time intensive or labor intensive. When we want to look at the cellular response, that tends to be a little bit harder to examine. So we know that an immune response or vaccination induces a really robust memory response, but how much that cellular memory response contributes to long-term immunity, particularly in COVID, is not yet well understood. The other difference between what happens when you have high levels of antibody versus what happens when you have a high cellular immune response is that antibody is the only immune factor that can protect you from being infected, right? So the virus enters, antibody binds it before it could even come in contact with your cells. Your cellular memory, your memory T cells, your memory B cells, those can't get reactivated until you become reinfected. Okay, so the first level of defense with protective immunity is antibodies so that the virus can't even re-enter your cells. But if those antibody levels wane and now the virus doesn't get as neutralized and those viral particles can enter our bodies and infect, now that's when our cellular response takes over. So there's sort of like two different levels that we're talking about. So I hope that answered.
Thank you. There's one more. Isn't the COVID vaccine still a trial vaccine? It's not considered a full-blown vaccine since it hasn't been out long enough? Question mark.
Absolutely not. So the clinical trials were completed and all the data was submitted to the FDA. So basically there's different levels of approval within the FDA. So once the vaccine as it was designed goes through all those steps of the trial, there's, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, you collect all the data, all that data gets submitted to the FDA. The FDA then can grant what's known as emergency use approval. All of the data regarding safety and efficacy that the FDA requires for emergency use approval is the same as the data that it requires for full approval. The only difference is that for full approval, they require it to be a certain length of time past the trial. So for emergency use, you can apply for emergency use once you're at 2 months past the final enrollment of all those trial participants. For full approval, regardless of the scenario, they require 6 months. So that's why these companies, even though they showed that the vaccine was highly effective and very safe, they couldn't directly apply for full approval. So they applied for emergency use approval. The only real differences when it comes to emergency use is just a lot of how the vaccine is going to be packaged, how it's going to be marketed, how it's going to be labeled, really has nothing to do with the science behind whether the vaccine works and whether the science is safe. So that's why we were able to get the emergency use. The next important thing to know is that the Pfizer vaccine has now been granted full FDA approval. So the Pfizer vaccine, the mRNA vaccine that comes from Pfizer, is completely approved by the FDA. They've now are past that 6-month part. They filed all the remaining paperwork that they needed to file. It's been reviewed, and it's again been determined that this vaccine continues to be safe and effective.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's it for now.
Okay. Thank you for the questions. Keep putting them in the chat. I'm going to keep going. So now getting into the specifics of these vaccines, there are currently 3 vaccines that are approved for use in the US, the Pfizer and the Moderna, both using the messenger RNA technology, and the J&J vaccine, which uses a viral vector. Minor differences between these two. The mRNA vaccines are 2 shots. Pfizer is 2 shots spaced 3 weeks apart. Moderna is 4 days apart. The dose is a little bit different between the Pfizer and the Moderna. The J&J is only 1 shot. The Pfizer is the vaccine that's been approved for 12 years and older. So if you do have any children who are 12 years or older, they are eligible to receive just that vaccine. The data that's shown here with effectiveness, this was the data that came out of the original trials. So for both the Pfizer and the Moderna, after the initial clinical trial, they were both shown to be highly effective, about 95% effective against infections and 100% effective against death from COVID-19. The J&J, a little bit less effective in regards to infections, but still 100% effective against death. This was data pre-Delta, okay? Delta has changed this a little bit. We know that Delta is more infectious, and because it's more infectious, it's been spreading more, and we are seeing that uptick in hospitalization. But if we look at these vaccines, their effectiveness against Delta, what is really striking is that while they have lost some of their efficacy in preventing infection, so this is looking at New York State residents, and it's combined data from all 3 vaccines. So if you look at people who have been fully vaccinated, regardless of any of those 3 vaccines that they received, you can see that the effectiveness in preventing infection has dropped from an average of around 92% to about 80%. But the protection against hospitalization has held steady. And this is remarkable because really these vaccines are designed to prevent hospitalization and death. That is what we wanted to accomplish when we made these vaccines. And they are still showing really strong effectiveness at preventing hospitalization and death, even with the Delta variant. So this data just came out last week. They actually, like I said, in the previous figure, that was kind of showing you the data of all the vaccines combined. It really didn't differentiate between who received what vaccine. But the latest data that just came from the CDC last week did look at the differences in effectiveness against hospitalization from the Delta variant, looking at the 3 different vaccines. And remarkably, the Moderna vaccine has been shown to be the most effective. It is still about 93% effective in preventing hospitalization against Delta. Pfizer dipped down a little bit, 88%. That's the vaccine that I got. And the J&J vaccine is holding at about 71%. These numbers are going to change. You know, we went through a phase between May and July and August where the proportion of infections were changing from the original variant or some of the other variants that were circulating to predominantly Delta. So this is really cumulative data. So once we have some more data on solely Delta circulating, these numbers might change a little bit. But for those of you who like things presented pictorially, I think this picture is worth 1,000 words. This is basically showing you the share of cases in the vaccinated versus those who are not vaccinated or not fully vaccinated. So you can see these little green bars show you of all the COVID-19 cases that have been reported, the amount that have been reported in vaccinated people versus those who are unvaccinated. I didn't include every state's data. I just did a screen capture, but at the bottom, you can see here the data from New Jersey. This was as of August, but New Jersey did just release some more recent data. The number or the share of overall cases among fully vaccinated has upticked a little bit. It's now at 0.3%. And the amount of COVID circulating among the not fully vaccinated is 99.7%. So this basically is telling us the vaccine is working. The vaccine is really circulating amongst the unvaccinated or not the fully vaccinated rather than the vaccinated. All right, so just a little bit about those who are interested in how these vaccines work. I know there is some concern because these are new vaccine formulations. So vaccines come in all different forms, from viruses that are weakened to viruses that are killed to just giving a little bit of protein from certain viruses or bacteria. But these are our first vaccines that are approved for human use that use genetic material. So in the case of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, we're taking mRNA, which is the genetic material that the virus uses to make more copies of virus. And we're just taking the smidge of that mRNA that gives the directions on how to make the spike protein. So what's actually going into your body in this vaccine or these 2 vaccines is not instructions to make a whole viral particle. The vaccine cannot generate a whole COVID or SARS-CoV-2 viral particle. All it's giving is the instructions to make a little bit of that spike protein. And once it gets into our cells will start making the spike protein. The mRNA itself dissolves. mRNA is a very unstable molecule. So if any of you are worried about having this genetic material floating around inside of you, don't be concerned. mRNA is so unstable. If any of you have done work in a lab, you know how many experiments get ruined because your mRNA got degraded. So the mRNA is really only in your body for a couple days. That spike protein will get made for a couple weeks. And basically that spike protein, again, can't make any viral particles, can't be transferred to any other people. But what it does is it shows it to your immune system. So now your immune cells see that spike protein and they learn how to launch that attack against them, right? And so now our cells get activated, we make antibodies, we activate our memory cells, and that's what's going to allow our body to fight off COVID the next time we encounter it in nature. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine works somewhat similarly, except this uses what's known as a viral vector. So we take a harmless virus called an adenovirus. Adenoviruses circulate in nature. They cause the common cold. In this case, the adenovirus that we use is lab made, and it's generated so that it can't infect anything. It's basically just like an empty package. And we take a little bit of DNA that, again, codes for just the spike protein. We put it in that little adenoviral package, and then that adenovirus can enter our cells, deposit that piece of DNA that then can code for the spike protein. And from there on out, that pretty much works similar to the other vaccine, where now our own bodies make the spike protein, our immune response, our immune system sees that spike protein, generates a response against it, and now we have protective immunity. Okay, please, if you have any questions, if I'm going too fast, put it in the chat. So I really wanted to present these numbers because I know there's concern about the vaccine and is it too new and was it studied enough? We are now at the point where 2.4 billion people worldwide have been vaccinated against COVID-19. When we're talking about worldwide vaccination, it's important to remember there are other vaccines that are approved in other countries that we have not studied in the United States and are not approved in the United States. So of those 2.4 billion, they're receiving a variety of different types of COVID vaccines that have been made elsewhere. But regardless, that's a lot of people, okay? And through what we've seen with those 2.4 billion people, we're still finding that it's safe and it's effective. In the United States, 181 million people are fully vaccinated. That's a little over half of our total population. And in New Jersey, about 63% of our total population has been vaccinated. That's 5.6 million people. So we are at the point where, you know, when we give vaccines, the data collection doesn't end at the clinical trial. There's what's known as phase 4. So that means after the vaccine gets approved, either fully or for emergency use, the FDA still requires that you collect what's known as real world data. How does this vaccine actually work once it starts to be administered to the whole population? And that needs to be reported back to the FDA. And so now with this real world data, we can safely say, again, that this vaccine is highly effective and it is safe. Okay, so I kind of made a list here of what are the commonly asked questions. These are all questions that I've had to address to people. I don't know if anybody wants to raise their hand and have me address something specifically or put it in the chat, or if you guys just want to wait patiently as I go through my list.
If anyone
we only have 10 minutes.
No, that's okay. If anyone has a question, I mean, we could really go to 6:55 if needed. I could walk fast down to the auditorium. If you have a question, you are able to unmute yourself. So please feel free to do so, or you can type it in the chat if you're more comfortable that way.
Okay, so I'm just going to start going through some of these things, but please, if you want me to jump to something else, let me know. I've already kind of covered some of this stuff so far. The COVID-19 vaccine cannot give you COVID-19. None of the vaccines have any live infectious particles. Even the mRNA vaccines, that mRNA that we give isn't isolated from actual virus. It's RNA that's been generated in a lab. The vaccine cannot alter your DNA, okay? The mRNA vaccines, that mRNA doesn't even get close to your DNA. Your DNA is housed in the nucleus of your cells, and the mRNA doesn't go into the nucleus. In terms of what else is in the vaccines, so again, in terms of the mRNA vaccines, there's no preservatives, there's no aluminum, there's no mercury, there's no egg products. So if you're allergic to eggs and that has kept you from getting other vaccines, you don't have to worry about that here. There's no egg products. The active ingredient, like we said, is the messenger RNA, and the inactive ingredients are all things that we find in nature, all things that you've normally ingested. Lipids, which are basically fats, those are the little bubbles that we package the mRNA into. Again, that mRNA is unstable. If we just let it float around freely, it will just degrade. So we put it in this little fat bubble, similar to cholesterol, similar to what's found in our food. We have different salts and acids that are just there to help stabilize the pH of the vaccine. similar to what you find in your table salt, similar to what you find in things like vinegar. And then there's some sugars that are there to help in the freezing process. Again, the sugars that are used are no different than the sugars you find in your food. Okay, so I like to joke around and say, you know, this is an organic vaccine. This is about as natural as you can get. So if you're worried about something foreign being in your body, there, you know, you should not. And that mRNA degrades really quickly. Again, can't alter your DNA. mRNA cannot convert itself to DNA, and it doesn't even get into the nucleus. With the adenoviral vaccines, which use DNA, again, that DNA doesn't go anywhere near or get integrated into your own DNA. And that as well gets degraded eventually over time. I talked about this already. The mRNA is only in there a few days, so you don't have to worry about this foreign stuff being in your body. The spike protein, once that's made, it's only there for a couple weeks. And then the rest of the response is your own body. Okay, and this is the case with all vaccines, right? The vaccine components are just there to trigger the immune response, but the downstream effects is the work that your own body does. We're just training our own body to deal with this infection, so we don't have to worry about getting sick. We don't have to worry about taking all the foreign and chemical medications that we would need to take if we were sick. So it's really all natural. Where does the vaccine go? I've heard this a bunch of times. I've heard claims that the vaccine is getting into our brain, and that's why people have neurological issues after they get vaccinated, or it's getting into their reproductive tract. The answer to that question is no, it's not going to those places. The vaccine gets injected very locally in the arm muscle. The majority of the vaccine is going to be in those cells in your arm. That's where most of it stays. Some of the vaccine will migrate to your lymph nodes. For those of you who aren't familiar with lymph nodes are basically where your immune responses are initiated. We have them throughout our body. And so when we have the entry of a foreign material into a part of our body, basically our lymph nodes and our lymphatic system drains everything that's coming into our tissue and acts as a filter basically to weed out whatever garbage just entered our system and to show it to our immune system. So whatever doesn't stay in the muscle, you can find locally in some of those lymph nodes. A lot of you are probably familiar with the lymph nodes in your throat here, because whenever you're sick, you know, people want to touch your throat and feel if you have swollen lymph nodes. Swollen lymph nodes are indicating that you have an immune response. So after you get vaccinated, you might have some soreness under your arm here because we have lots of lymph nodes in our armpit here. And that's an indication that we're generating an immune response. But once the vaccine gets into those local lymph nodes, it doesn't really travel anywhere else. It can't get into our central nervous system. We have what's known as a blood-brain barrier that keeps things like that out. And it hasn't been found in our reproductive tract. The timing of the vaccine, I talked about this a little bit. We were able to generate these vaccines so quickly because it was built on a history of vaccine research. We've been, you know, doing vaccinations since the 18th century. The mRNA vaccines, even though they're new, they've been in development for over a decade. We have the technology now to sequence genomes really rapidly and really cheaply. So as soon as we found this new infectious agent, we were able to sequence its genome, you know, within weeks. A lot of the research was based upon previous research that was done in previous coronavirus outbreaks. That was the original SARS virus and something known as MERS, which was a Mediterranean coronavirus outbreak. So we already knew a lot about the spike protein. We knew the spike protein was what we wanted to target. And funding, so much funding went into this. The timeline was a little bit different too. So normally the pace of FDA approval in clinical trials is really slow. You do one phase. Once that's completed, you do the next, then you go on to the next. With this, a lot of the phases were combined into one, so we could do them quicker, and we sort of overlapped. The other thing that is really important here is that when you traditionally develop a vaccine, after you do your clinical trial, you get your regulatory approval, that's when manufacturing begins. Because of the funding that happened from the government through that Operation Warp Speed, I don't know if you guys remember hearing about that on the news, the decision was made once these trials hit phase 3, we were going to start producing them, right? So we started making the vaccines before we even knew that they were really going to work and be safe, so that as soon as we had that data, we could start administering it. So as soon as these companies had the data, submitted it to the FDA, got their emergency use approval, within a week, they were distributing the vaccine. So that's not normally how things occur. And so that's why we were able to do this so quickly. No steps were skipped. The number of participants in these trials was even more robust than usual. And like I said, this was really a group effort by the whole scientific community. Even people like me who didn't study coronavirus switched gears and started doing research on coronavirus. I like to think about it if you had 10 acres of land and you needed to mow it yourself versus if you had all your neighbors come over and help you mow it, you'd be able to accomplish it 5-10 times quicker. That's basically what happened here. It was a group effort. And we had the funding to really make things work. Adverse events. I know everybody's thinking about adverse events. Adverse events are common with any vaccination. We have the typical symptoms of fatigue, muscle pain, injection site soreness, sometimes a slight fever. These are all signs that our immune system is working. I don't know if you remember all the way in the beginning of this presentation, I told you that we have that innate response that causes inflammation and that we need that response to tell our body that we have something foreign to deal with and we need to generate a more specific immune response. So these minor side effects are all telling us that our immune system is getting activated. I, for one, was a little upset that I didn't have more of a reaction. After my first shot, I had a little bit of arm pain. And then after my second shot, I was a little bit tired. But, I was like, is my immune system doing what it's supposed to do? I kind of really wanted to feel a little bit more. When it comes to serious adverse events, these are extremely rare, okay? So there's 3 main serious adverse events that have been detected. One that I'm hearing the most about lately and people asking about is myocarditis or pericarditis, which is inflammation of the heart or the lining around the heart. This has been shown to occur in some individuals after the second dose of the mRNA vaccine. So that's the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. It's mostly reported in young men. So there have been about 40.6 cases per million second doses given. It's seen a little bit in females, but not nearly as much. But one thing to note here is that the symptoms are generally mild and they resolve with treatment. So if this did happen after a vaccine, all of those individuals have been treated and everything's resolved with no problems. So even with serious adverse events, they're happening in controlled environments. The other serious adverse event that we heard a lot about, and this actually popped up during the trial, the clinical trials and caused a pause, is the clotting that was occurring after the J&J vaccine. Again, extremely rare, about 4 to 6 people out of every million vaccinated. And it's important to note, and I'm going to show a figure on this after, that the risk of blood clots is far higher from COVID-19 itself than from vaccination. Same with myocarditis. The risk of myocarditis is way higher if you get COVID vaccine than the chance of you getting it, if you get COVID disease versus if you get the vaccine. And then the last one that people ask me about a lot is Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's a neurological syndrome. There have been reports of this that have popped up on the vaccine adverse reporting system, but not enough for us to tell whether it's related to the vaccines or coincidental. We do have certain vaccines that can be associated with Guillain-Barré. The flu vaccine is an example of that. But in this case, we're still not sure if these cases are just by chance or if they're actually connected. But what I really want to stress is that serious adverse events to vaccines always appear within 2 months of inoculation. This has been the case for every single vaccine that we've ever studied, okay? Within 2 months, if there's going to be a severe adverse event, it's going to show up in 2 months. So we're at the point now, we're well past 2 months of people being vaccinated with these 3 vaccines. So we can comfortably say there's no other adverse events that are going to come up. Okay, this is it. And what I really want to show you is this is comparing the risk of adverse events in an actual COVID infection, which are the red bars, versus getting the COVID vaccine. So you can see deep vein thrombosis, that's a fancy word for clots. So you can see that the risk of having blood clots is way greater if you get COVID than if you're vaccinated. Having myocarditis greater, or pericarditis greater if you get COVID than if you're vaccinated. Things like kidney injury, pulmonary embolism, that's also a clot. The only difference here is lymphadenopathy. Lymphadenopathy is a fancy word for swelling of your lymph nodes. And just like I told you, that's exactly what you want to see after a vaccination. You want your lymph nodes to swell because that's an indication that your immune response is activated. This is also, though, a reason why they are recommending that if you're due for your mammogram, don't get it anywhere near your vaccine, because if your lymph nodes are swollen, when they do that mammogram, any of you women out there know, they like to push everything over. They want to view those lymph nodes and see if anything's happening. So initially when vaccination started, that lymphadenopathy that was occurring in response to the vaccine was kind of triggering some abnormal mammograms. So now they're recommending that you wait, if you just received the vaccine, wait to get your mammogram by a month or 2. Okay, what are we doing on timing? Okay. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but if your question is if COVID-19 vaccines affect fertility, the answer is a hard no. Absolutely not. No evidence whatsoever. There's been studies just to verify. Millions of women within reproductive age have now been vaccinated, and there's been no increase in the rates of miscarriage or infertility. If you're pregnant, vaccine completely safe. And in fact, it's recommended by the majority of obstetricians that you get vaccinated, because pregnant women are at an increased risk of severe illness if they contract COVID. Also, if you're pregnant and you get the vaccine, you can pass your antibodies to your baby. You do not have to worry about passing anything from the vaccine to your baby. That mRNA does not get anywhere near your baby. Even if it did, probably wouldn't matter. But what does pass is the antibody. So even though infants are not eligible for the vaccine, if you're pregnant or breastfeeding and you've been vaccinated, you're going to pass that protection to your baby. So that's an added bonus of getting vaccinated if you're pregnant. So a lot of people are saying, you know, we can see that vaccinated people can still become infected. So if I can still become infected, why should I get vaccinated if it's not even protecting me from infection? So the important thing to remember is that none of the vaccines that we have are 100% effective. They're designed to reduce the risk of becoming infected, and particularly the risk of developing severe disease. It's been shown time and time again with COVID vaccines that breakthrough infections, so those infections that are occurring in vaccinated people, are typically mild or asymptomatic, and they resolve quicker. That's because, remember, that is a secondary immune response. Think about that graph I showed with the 2 peaks. Those who are vaccinated are starting with that second peak, which means their immune response is getting activated quicker, they're making higher levels of antibody, and the antibody is more robust. The overwhelming majority of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are occurring in the unvaccinated. This virus is circulating through the unvaccinated. It's not circulating through the vaccinated. In New Jersey, of those who have been vaccinated, 5.6 million people, only 0.35% have tested positive for COVID. Only 0.007% have required hospitalization, and only 0.002% have died. This is more national data. Green line showing you the rate of hospitalizations in vaccinated, the blue line showing you the rate of vaccination in the unvaccinated. So as there has been a shift to Delta, the hospitalization rate has skyrocketed in unvaccinated. It's held relatively stable in the fully vaccinated. So COVID vaccine will help keep you out of the hospital and help keep you alive. Vaccinated people can still spread the virus if they become infectious, but remember, they're infectious for a much shorter period of time. Somebody who is unvaccinated will have uncontrolled viral replication for 2 to 3 weeks while they wait for their antibodies levels to get up. Somebody who's been vaccinated will only have that virus circulating unchecked for 2 to 3 days. Okay, that's a big difference. A lot less infectious particles being released by a vaccinated person versus an unvaccinated person. Okay, last thing, kids. Okay, we're all here because we have kids, right? In the school system, probably. Initially, when the COVID pandemic hit, the elderly were hit the hardest. Okay. Cases in children were relatively rare. Hospitalizations and deaths were even rarer. As we've shifted to the Delta variant, you can see, right? So here we are in May, where Delta was not the most prevalent circulating variant. And now in August, when it was the most, there's been a 720% increase in COVID cases in kids, 356% increase in hospitalizations, and a 229% increase in deaths. I don't know about you, but I am not okay with any childhood deaths. Kids are not supposed to die. Kids are not supposed to die from infectious disease. Okay. So if you want to look at this on the scale of, well, it's not as bad as what's happening in adults, that's not the scale that I'm okay looking at it. I don't want any children to get sick. Okay. So even though we know that children can be infected and children can have severe infections, majority of children do recover from COVID. But one of the things that we're still investigating and still learning a lot about is the long-term impact of COVID on children. So it's now been known that even children who have asymptomatic infections or very mildly symptomatic infections and recover from COVID can experience some of these more severe long-term impacts of COVID. So one of the things is something that we've come to be known as long COVID. So this is a case where there are these long-term effects that have been found to be related to COVID infections that are affecting all different aspects of a person's health. And with children, it's been found that some of the long COVID symptoms that are really detrimental to them are things such as fatigue, headache, brain fog, sleep disturbances, long-term changes in smell and taste, and chronic fatigue. And these could be really detrimental to our children and their development. It's going to have an impact on their ability to focus and school properly. So even though they might have recovered from that initial COVID infection without any appearance of detriment, this is something that we're still learning a lot about, and a lot of children and adults, for that matter, are suffering from the effects of this long COVID syndrome. The other thing that you might have seen in the news is something called multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, or MISC. This is a more severe effect that has been found to be associated with COVID infections in children. So this is extremely rare, but it can be really severe. It typically shows up weeks after a COVID infection, generally around 6 weeks. So child's test positive for COVID. Again, in many instances, it's a mild or relatively asymptomatic COVID infection. And then 6 weeks later starts to experience these symptoms that involve all areas of the body, fever, abdominal pain, vomiting, diarrhea, rash, feeling really tired. And this is due to this robust inflammatory response. Again, it's not yet fully understood the connection between COVID infection and this multi-inflammatory syndrome in children. It's very similar to something that we've studied in the past called Kawasaki disease. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with that, but this appears to be somewhat related to that in terms of it's a inflammatory syndrome that just causes inflammation to rear up in this very nasty ways. And many children are hospitalized with this, again, after what can be a relatively mild case of COVID. So again, this is why we really want to protect our children from this disease. Even if the odds are pretty good for them during their initial infection, we don't yet know what the long-term effects are and what can develop later on in terms of impact to their health. Again, this is just another table showing data that came out of Washington University, linking issues in pretty much every system in the body to people who had COVID-19, anywhere from cardiovascular issues, respiratory issues, long-term gastrointestinal issues, and mental health issues have been linked to COVID infection. So again, these are long-term effects that are going to continue to be a burden on our health system and everyone in our community for years to come. So there is some light on the horizon. Breaking news just today, Pfizer announced that they have results from their COVID-19 vaccine trial in the age group 5 to 11-year-olds. So in this trial, children were given a 2-dose regimen similar to the one that's given to adults. However, they used a smaller dose. So in adults, it's a 30 microgram dose, and in children, they lowered that to 10 micrograms. Over 2,000 participants were enrolled in this trial, and the data shows that the vaccine was safe, well tolerated, and showed robust neutralizing antibody responses. So basically, they compared the levels of antibodies being produced in children in this age group to that which we see in older groups that are vaccinated. And they found that children made same levels of antibodies. And again, side effects were typically mild, just like they are with the vaccine for the older groups. So the Pfizer plans to submit these as soon as possible to the FDA and request emergency use authorization. So we're hoping by the end of October, early November, this can be available for that 5 to 11-year-old group. Has taken a little while to get this going. First of all, the initial trials focus solely on the adult population. We know that children, when it comes to immune responses, are not just small adults. Their immune system actually works differently. So that's why they weren't included in the original trial. We knew that we would need to do a separate trial that just looked at the effects of children and really focused on finding the right dose. The FDA had requested that Pfizer and Moderna, who's currently doing a trial for children as well, we haven't seen any data from that yet, but they required that both of them double the number of participants, again, as a precautionary measure, particularly to make sure that any potential rare side effects can be detected. We know that the larger the pool of individuals that we're studying are, the more likely we are to be able to detect those very rare side effects. So that is why the FDA asked to increase the number of participants so we can be sure that we would catch any rare side effects. And with at least the Pfizer, there were no severe rare side effects were noted in that. And in addition, the FDA asked for a longer follow-up. So with the initial vaccine, the companies needed to wait 2 full months of collecting data before they could submit that to the FDA. For this trial, the FDA asked for a 4 to 6 month follow-up of safety data. Again, just extra precaution with children. So, you know, we can be confident that the FDA is taking this seriously and doing everything to make sure that when we do get the data for these vaccines, we can be sure that they're safe and effective for this age group. All right, so this is a question that came up earlier. If I had COVID-19, if I've had it and recovered, do I still need the vaccine? Why should I get the vaccine? So as we discussed, our immunity wanes over time. It peaks and then it starts to basically diminish. And that's what happens when people have COVID-19. And so getting the vaccine after you've recovered is going to be recommended because you want to give your immune system that extra boost, right? So like we discussed, the first time you see something, your body makes antibodies. Those antibodies naturally degrade over time. by around 3 months, those antibody levels can get low, and you can become susceptible to infection again. So by giving that vaccine, you're giving your immune system a little boost. So we can see here on the right-hand side, I showed this graph earlier. And in this case, sort of the exposures are flip-flopped, right? So in this case, somebody's first exposure might be actually getting infected with COVID. So they're going to have that primary immune response. Remember, that immune response took a couple of weeks to develop, and then over time, it's going to wane. And in this case now, the vaccine would act as that second exposure and give that boost. So now the immune system is going to respond by making more antibodies. Again, those antibodies are going to be made quicker. They're going to be more effective, and they're going to generally stay at higher levels even after they wane a little bit. So by getting the vaccine after you've had COVID, you're giving your immune system an extra boost so it can stay protected. The vaccine will in no way impact the immunity that you did develop. So even, if say your immunity is still pretty strong against COVID, getting the vaccine won't change that. It will just help it. It will just give it a boost. Okay, and then lastly, I've heard some people say, if everybody is around me is vaccinated, if you're vaccinated, why should it matter if I am? And this is really an issue of how we think about infectious disease and how we treat infectious disease. So infectious disease is a health issue, but it's very different than a lot of the other health issues we experience. If we think about things like chronic pain or migraines or cancer, those are things that only impact the person who has that disease, in the physical sense, right? Can't be passed from one person to another. And so, if somebody has a headache and says, I don't want to take Tylenol, you know what? That's the only person who's affected by not taking that Tylenol. They're the one who has to suffer with that headache. Infectious disease is different because it's something that gets passed from person to person. So when we try to prevent infectious disease with vaccines, we're not just protecting the individual who received the vaccine, but we're protecting our entire community. So if you look here on the left-hand side, we have an example where we have a population where generally most people are susceptible. In this case, these little red bodies indicate infected individuals, and the blue bodies indicate susceptible individuals, individuals with no immunity. And in that situation, infectious disease can spread rapidly. And that's what we saw at the beginning of this pandemic, right? That one person just passed it to another, or several people who passed it to several people, and it just expanded exponentially. With vaccines, what we can do is help stop what's called the chain of transmission. So by creating this sort of protective bubble where a lot of people in the community are immune to that disease, we're going to give less space for that pathogen, that virus, to move through our population. So in this case, it would infect somebody, and that person would not have anybody to pass it to if everybody around them is protected by this bubble of immunity. So we can see that happening on the right-hand side. In this case, these green bodies are people who are immune. And so now when somebody catches that disease, they generally don't have as much space to pass it around, creating this bubble of protection. This is particularly important right now because we're at a spot where we have a good proportion of our population, which is our children younger than 12, who cannot yet be vaccinated. So by everyone who's able to get vaccinated, getting vaccinated, that's helping create a bubble of protection for our children, right? For those individuals in our population who cannot be vaccinated. And that's why you need to think about this in the sense of what it's doing for everybody around you, not just what it's doing for you. And then I just wanted to leave you with a slide of some trusted resources. Again, I know there's so much information out there, and it's really hard to make sense of what's what and what's real and what's accurate. So here's just a list of some sources that are go-to sources where you can always get accurate information. The World Health Organization, the CDC, the Mayo Clinic, which some of you may have heard, it's a really big hospital system, Johns Hopkins, the US Department of Health and Human Services, the FDA. And then two resources that I really like are the American Academy of Family Physicians and the American Academy of Pediatrics. If you go to any of these links, a lot of them have resources that aren't just for physicians and scientists, but are for, lay people as well. They have pages that talk about how the vaccines work, pages that have FAQs about the vaccine, same sort of information I presented here, just going through some of the facts and the myths that you're hearing about the vaccines. So I really recommend that you use these sources. If you hear something out there and you want to double check it, go to one of these sources and most likely you'll be able to find out if that information is accurate enough. So I just want to thank everybody again for joining me, and thank you for your questions. And I really hope that I made a difference and helped make sense of what can be a really, really confusing topic. So have a good night, everybody. Thank you.